started thinking about 43 years, and that is a long time. I tend not to be a person who thinks back a lot. I tend to be always thinking forward. And I realized that that time was an important time in the renaissance, not only of Fort Street, but of the city as well. There were a lot of things happening. And I sort of drew up a rough timeline, and I don't want this to become a series of rambling reminiscences, but I started singing here in 1962. And my experience up to that time as a church musician was essentially in Episcopal churches. I was in service at the end of the Korean War, and I got out of service in what, 1955, I think I got out of service. And passion prevailed, and I became married shortly after that and had a family, but decided to go back to school in the late 50s. During those years, I was asked to sing at St. Paul's Cathedral up on Woodward in Warren, and I was a member of a choir there. We had a men and boys choir, and being tenor soloist was essentially singing little 8-measure, 4-measure solos, periodically doing, we did a recording, I think, during those early years of Martin Shaw's Redeemer with little solo lines, but essentially it was an ensemble position. And when I was in service, reflecting on my life, if I ever was able to come out of that place, and I determined that I wanted to be a singer. I wanted to be the best singer I could possibly be. So things like directing were not really part of my purview at that time. That all came much later. When I came to Fort Street, it was as a member of the quartet, and it's kind of interesting what preceded that. During the late 50s and early 60s, you had here at Fort Street a quartet. One of the members of that quartet, Shirley Love, the mezzo-soprano, was pursuing a career as a singer. Shirley and I and several of the people who sang in the quartet at that time all studied with the same voice teacher. But Shirley Love had done a tour, this is in the late 50s, with Robert Shaw. Did a professional tour with Robert Shaw. And during that tour, she met Grant Williams, who was a tenor with Robert Shaw. He was a tenor section leader for Shaw. In fact, Grant is on an old recording that Shaw made of Stephen Foster's songs as one of the soloists. Anyway, Grant was in New York, and his career was kind of faltering. He was doing compromario roles at New York City Opera, but had studied choral conducting and was quite a fine, he was one of Shaw's assistants. He was quite a fine director. And Shirley and Grant started talking about, because Shirley was doing the tour and then coming back to Detroit, talked about forming a professional choir in Detroit. Grant had decided that he had had enough of New York. So his parents lived in Dearborn. He came back to Detroit. And this is like probably 1958 or so. So Grant and Shirley Love assembled what was to be called the Grant Williams Chorale. Now, the Grant Williams Chorale ultimately was the predecessor to what became the Ken Jewell Chorale. Many of you have heard of the Ken Jewell Chorale. Actually, Ken Jewell took over the Grant Williams Chorale, because Grant realized very quickly that there were not going to be opportunities to make a full-time living here as a choral conductor. But we rehearsed here, downstairs in the Great Hall, and we had a choir of about 30 singers. probably the best singers in the city, and or many of the best singers in the city, certainly. And we were able to rehearse here because of Shirley's being a member of the quartet. Some of the members of the music committee would come in and hear rehearsals periodically, and they decided that they wanted to change the quartet. Again, there was no choir here during those years. And so they decided to have, they approached Grant Williams. Grant was a wonderful conductor and a marvelous musician and a very fine church tenor. They approached Grant about forming and directing what they wanted to call the best quartet in the city. So Grant set about doing that. In the meantime, this Grant Williams Chorale began appearing with some of the local symphony orchestras because there were no choir. The big choir in the city at that time was the Rackham Choir, but Klein, Dr. Klein, who directed that, was having health problems, and that group was kind of faltering. So the Grant Williams Chorale rehearsed here and periodically performed here to pay back the church for the use of the facilities. In the meantime, Shirley Love decided to leave this area and go to New York. So the quartet was breaking up anyway, and I think that was maybe the initial stimulus that prompted the reformation of the quartet. Shirley left and ultimately ended up at the Metropolitan Opera and sang at the Metropolitan Opera for probably 20 years. So Grant announced to the choir that there were going to be auditions for the quartet position here at Fort Street. Imogene Bird, who was at that time the soprano in the quartet, also sang in the chorale. So we had auditions, and I remember Mr. Will Watson. Some of you probably know that name. Mr. Watson was on the music committee, and he ultimately passed away in his late 80s, I think. But he was a loyal supporter of the quartet and would come often to the rehearsals. Anyway, he sat in on the auditions. Several people in the chorale auditioned. It ended up that Imogene Bird was retained. Was retained as quartet. Bill McConnell, who later left the area within a year or two, left this area and moved to New England and was a baritone. And Mary Riley, a wonderful contralto who had studied with Theodore Harrison at the American Conservatory of Music in Chicago, was the contralto. So in 1960, I was singing St. Paul's Cathedral. 1962, early it was decided who the quartet members were going to be, but I had a commitment at St. Paul's Cathedral and was unable to leave there until after Easter of '62, and then came and joined the quartet here. And Grant Williams then would rehearse 4 singers each Wednesday evening, and we would supply the music for the service. We'd do an anthem, responses, and then each week one of the quartet members would do a solo. And I reflect on those times, and we were doing portions of Messiah with 4 people. It was a very good quartet for a number of years.